Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. As always, we have a great guest for you today that's going to give you the deeper understanding of what's going on in this Israeli-Hamas conflict that we have raging in the Middle East right now. And that is Israeli-American scholar and professor at Brown University, Omer Bartov. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your first name there. Great to have you on board, Professor. Thanks for coming on our show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, just for our viewers who may not know you, I just want to kind of set the stage a little bit for kind of who you are and what you bring to the table here and what you've experienced in life, especially. And we were talking just before we went live here that some of your family members were actually involved and were killed in the Holocaust during World War II, and your mother barely survived. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that and then a book that you wrote about it.
Sure. So I wrote a book that came out in 2018 called Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach. And that town is a town in which my mother was born and raised, and she left it when she was 11 with her brothers and parents. But the rest of my extended family stayed there, and they were all murdered during World War II in the Holocaust. And years later, I talked with my mother about her childhood and thought I really needed to know what happened there. So I reconstructed the story of how Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians had lived in that town, which was then in Poland and now is in Ukraine, and for 4 centuries. And at the end of that time, the neighbors killed their neighbors with the help of German perpetrators who were there.
Man, it's really hard to fathom that. I've actually been to the Dachau concentration camp in Germany and to Auschwitz in Poland, and just as an American who's not connected with any way personally with it, it's just horrible. I can't even imagine if you actually have family members. So we admire and respect your ability to keep going on and to tell these stories so that people genuinely don't forget. Now I want to talk a little bit about what's going on right now. Now, you were an officer in the IDF, and you actually, tell me if I got this correctly, you actually were involved in some military operations in Gaza as an officer. Did I understand that correct, or was it in Lebanon?
No, I was. So I became a soldier in January 1973. Then in October, the war of 1973 broke out on October 6th. So 50 years and a day before the Hamas attack of October 7th, 2023. And during the war, I was lucky. I was on the Jordanian border, so the Jordanians did not attack. After the war, I was transferred to the Syrian front, what was called the Syrian enclave, and there we saw a fair amount of combat. We were shelled, basically. We were sitting there getting shelled all day and rebuilding what was destroyed during the night, with a number of people getting killed and wounded. But part of my service, I was later a company commander in Sinai. That was before the Sinai was returned to Egypt. And my battalion command was in Gaza. So we would go a lot to Gaza, which was then not a great place to be in. But the population was about a quarter of what it is now.
Wow.
So you can imagine how dense the population is there. And I also had an experience of serving occupation for a short period of time, actually in an Egyptian town. And that I recall very well. I was then a platoon commander, and just walking down the street of an Egyptian town with people behind the windows. They're looking at you, they're afraid of you, and you're a bit afraid of them. You don't know what to expect. They're in the shade, you're in the sun. And it gave me this really strong sense of what occupation is like and why we shouldn't have it for longer than absolutely necessary, if at all.
Yeah, it's ironic as you're speaking that it reminded me. I actually went on a joint patrol in Afghanistan with a Polish unit going through an Afghanistan town, and I'll never forget the looks that they gave us going through. We were allegedly the good guys, but they were more afraid of us, I think, than the Taliban. Actually, they were afraid of both sides. So I do have some sense of what you experienced there, but that's especially poignant for what we're going to talk about here, because you could say what things feel and look like from an Israeli side, as well as what the observation of what it's going to look like from the Palestinian side. And we're going to get into that in just a second. But first, I want to real quick bring people up to date on the tactical situation that's going on the ground here, because that's going to have some relevance to what we're about to talk about. Gary, if you could bring that battle map up. This is from the Institute for the Study of War, just published this morning. And those blue areas that you see in the north, northeast, and all the way down south, basically is a cordon that the Israeli Defense Forces have basically surrounded the city of Gaza, and now they've started moving into the city proper, especially on that western side near the coast. And lots of fighting has been going on there, lots of armor attacks. They've been using, obviously, air attacks, air bombs, and lots of bulldozer stuff. And maybe if you can talk a little bit about that in just a second, about what those bulldozers do. That's a little bit different than what we might have seen in some of the other urban fights that we've had recently. But the point being that there has been a great deal of destruction so far of the physical infrastructure of the city that the Palestinians at some point are going to need to live in again. And the question is going to be, as the IDF goes after Hamas, first I just want to talk the military aspect, was they continue to go after Hamas in these areas and clear the buildings. What is the risk that they destroy so much that there's nowhere left for the Palestinians to come back to whenever this does end?
So it looks like they have done that already. From the reports that I've seen on Israeli TV, among other things, with Israeli reporters who have been allowed in. Much of the city of Gaza has been destroyed. About 1 million Palestinians from the northern part of Gaza were told to leave. They were told it was for humanitarian reasons, so that they are not harmed in the fighting. But meanwhile, much of their housing has been destroyed. The fighting itself has been effective, I guess, in the sense that the Israeli forces seem to have taken over those parts of Gaza, maybe faster than they anticipated, but it's not at all clear that they have really undermined Hamas's military ability, and certainly not its control over its forces and its own command structure.
Yeah. Now, I've been surprised about a couple of things so far. Is number one, it also is going, at least so far, faster than I anticipated it was going to. But it's also interesting that I've seen a number of reports out that say that reports from the IDF soldiers say they're a little bit confused because there hasn't been that many casualties among the Hamas side, meaning they haven't met them in a lot of fighting so far. And the question is, are they just staying in the subterranean areas? Are they going to pop up later on somewhere else? Are they trying to draw Israel in maybe more into the city, and maybe they'll get more difficult? Do you have any sense for how that's going and why it might be that Hamas hasn't yet fought that much?
Look, I mean, it's hard to say. That's the truth. I mean, some may be underground, and they're popping out because they have these tunnels. So they pop out behind Israeli forces in the midst of them, and they're causing daily casualties. They're not very heavy casualties, but still, there've been, I think, about 50 soldiers already killed, and that's
240 wounded, I think, is the number I saw this morning.
Right. So, I mean, these are not huge losses, but still. And so I think some are underground. I think many probably melted into the population, and I think many others are in the south. And now the Israelis are saying that they're moving, they're asking the population in the eastern part of the southern part of the Gaza Strip to move to the west so that they can move there. So they are pushing the population increasingly into a smaller and smaller area, and they're hoping to find Hamas fighters there. The truth is that it's not clear entirely that they can destroy Hamas militarily. I think that ultimately, if they are to remove Hamas from the Gaza Strip as the hegemon, it would not simply be a military operation. It would have to be by some kind of political international agreement. Otherwise, it can become what Lebanon became from Israel, where it ended up staying for 20 years, taking many losses, and then leaving.
Man, let's hope we don't get a repeat of that, because the conditions, I think, are so much worse now that we'll be heading into that for the people, especially on the ground. Professor, I want to play a bit of a report that was actually shot about 2 months before October 7th. And it kind of laid the groundwork for some real political problems within the Israeli society itself and between Israel and Palestine. It touches on both of those. And coming out of this, I'm going to ask you a couple of specific questions. Gary, let's roll that tape.
Months and months of the biggest protests that Israel has ever seen. Yet they couldn't stop the far-right government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pushing through a law to weaken the Supreme Court. Its judges can no longer overturn government decisions they consider to be unreasonable. Opponents from across Israeli society say that ministers can now do what they like. Some say it will enable Netanyahu to stop his own prosecution on corruption charges. Supporters say the legislation will stop judicial interference in politics. As Israel trumpets its democracy and argues with itself over the law, what does it mean for Palestinians living under constant oppression? This issue has left Israel deeply divided.
I say to the opposition leaders, you can continue to argue and fight, but you can also do something else. You can reach agreements about what to do next. Let's come to an agreement. This is my call to you, and I extend my hand to call for peace and mutual respect amongst us.
It's impossible with this government to reach agreements to safeguard democracy. What they want to do is to dismantle the country, security and the unity of the people of Israel and our international relations. There is no way to continue to deal with them.
Well, there have been protests now for just over 29 weeks against this judicial reform. And when these protests started, people felt, certainly those against the reform, felt that this was potentially an existential threat for Israel, a country that they believed had been founded with the idea that different branches of Judaism could coexist peacefully. In Tel Aviv, you have this more liberal, secular bubble, essentially, an island in the middle of what has become a much more conservative country. And the people we've been speaking to, the protesters we've been speaking to, are saying they're not sure how they can continue, how this country can continue to coexist when the government that is in charge, in their opinion, seems bent on imposing these essentially religious-based laws, and they see this as the risk in the future of living in a country that is more ruled by religious law than by secular law. We've had the doctors group, a WhatsApp group set up for doctors looking for ways of leaving the country. We've had the IT sector suffering from a lack of investment over fears of the future direction of the country. So yes, there's enormous stresses and strains on Israeli society, and they will continue in the coming months as people decide how to approach this new law. Will there be an appeal to the Supreme Court? Will the Supreme Court decide to issue a ruling on this new law, or will they just ignore it and say we can't interfere? There are many more difficult and challenging questions to be answered in the months to come that will put even more stress on Israeli society.
Now, so that had been 20 some odd weeks of protests, and they anticipated that was going to continue on there. Now, one of the first questions I want to ask you is that I had read at the time during all these things that part of the split within the Israeli society was, especially it was around the military and the reservists in particular. And it said that many of them were refusing to go on duty. They were refusing to train as a protest of what was going on, in addition to being in the streets. And then there's some expectation or some belief that that had something to do with the blinding of the Israeli intelligence to what happened on October the 7th. Do you believe that had any relation to that? And did all of that induce the Hamas to take this drastic step of this terrorist activity on October 7th? Or did it was it planned long before that and it was just coincidental?
So I think this is a set of very important questions. I do think that the sort of disintegration that could be seen happening in Israel in the months between February, when the government declared this so-called judicial overhaul, which was really just to weaken the judiciary and strengthen the executive, and October, the attack by Hamas, I think what was happening in Israeli society made it appear weaker, more vulnerable, and may have played some role in the attack, although I don't think it was the main impetus. Secondly, yes, there were many reservists, and most importantly, reserve pilots who are a major part of the Israeli Air Force, who were saying that they would not serve in a country that would not be democratic, and they perceived, I think rightly, that the direction was more authoritarian, a sort of illiberal democracy in Israel, the model of Hungary or something of that sort. That was the most effective part of the demonstrations, and I'll say, because I was involved in that in part. I also demonstrated. I was in Israel in June. It was part of the sort of took part in all that. But in August, a number of colleagues and myself issued a statement, which was then signed by about 2,500 major figures in academia, intellectuals, religious leaders, and so forth, called the elephant in the room. And what we argued was that while the protests were against a judicial overhaul, the protesters themselves were refusing to talk about what the main issue was. The main issue was the occupation. That is, the government was trying to do the judicial overhaul, Netanyahu and his very extreme right-wing coalition partners, so as to change conditions on the ground in the West Bank. They were sure that Gaza was just a marginal issue and totally under control. And in the West Bank, what they wanted to do was to enhance the settlement and to gradually annex larger and larger parts of the West Bank. And they wanted to prevent any judicial intervention in that. And that was why they were trying to weaken the judiciary. So we said, that is the elephant in the room. And that elephant exploded in everybody's faces on October 7th, 2023. It turned out that you could not simply ignore or manage the Palestinian issue, as the Israeli government under Netanyahu had been saying for at least 20 years. And I think that the main impetus for this attack, which had been planned for probably 2 years or so, but the main direct impetus was the apparent, almost successful negotiations between Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. And that was just on the eve of the Hamas attack. And that would have completely marginalized the Palestinian issue, because then Israel would have had peace with the largest, most important Arab country, and the Palestinians would have just been forgotten. And they wanted to make the point.
Let me just interrupt for just 1 second, because as it turns out, we actually have a clip of Netanyahu talking early this year about that exact issue.
I went directly to the Arab states and forged with a new concept of peace for peace, peace through strength. I forged 4 historic peace agreements.
The Abraham Accords.
The Abraham Accords, which is twice the number of peace agreements that all my predecessors in 70 years got combined.
Well, let me ask you about it, because I know you're so committed to the Abraham Accords, which are a huge achievement by President Trump and by you. And I know you want to keep going. What happens when, let's say, the big prize is, I mean, I know Sudan's on the table, some of these Southeastern Asian countries are on the table, but the big prize is Saudi Arabia, obviously. What happens when Saudi Arabia gets the U.S. to go along with some of the things that they want from the U.S. in terms of security measures, but they say, look, Prime Minister Netanyahu, they probably call you Bibi, I need something for the Palestinians in order to go along with this. I can't just do this around the Palestinians. That's important to me and to my constituency. What are you willing to give? Are you willing to let people in the West Bank vote? Are you willing to let the 300,000 Arabs who have residency in East Jerusalem vote?
Well, I'm certainly willing to have them have all the powers that they need to govern themselves, but none of the powers that can threaten us. And this means that Israel should have the overriding security responsibility. I think there's a formula for peace, but my view is, because of the fact that the persistent Palestinian refusal, which goes back a century, to recognize a Jewish state, a nation state for the Jewish people in any boundary, that persistent refusal persists. If we wait for them, we're not going to have peace. People said you have to work your way outside in, first inside out. First, peace with the Palestinians, peace with the Arab world. I think realistically it's going to be the other way around.
But are you?
If we make peace with Saudi Arabia, it depends on the Saudi leadership, and bring effectively the Arab-Israeli conflict to an end, I think we'll circle back to the Palestinians and get a workable peace with the Palestinians. I think that's possible, and I think that's the way to go.
Now, a couple of things there, a lot to unpack. I can only imagine what's going through your mind. But on the first point, I wonder if you can address for our viewers who may not have the depth of knowledge here, a couple of things. On the one hand, he said that the Palestinians have been refusing to talk, and so that's part of the problem right there, and they don't want to give away anything, and so he doesn't want to give them the right to vote. He was pretty clear on, I just wanted to let them govern themselves, which would seem to negate any kind of a possibility of a two-state solution, which I want to get into again and separately. But then the other thing is that he was basically saying, yeah, we're going to get the big prize first, and then we'll come back here when there's no leverage between them. So, and then that's all juxtaposed against Israel saying, hey, there's all this security threat. We have to keep ourselves free from the threat in the West Bank and in Gaza Strip, and that's why we basically can't do a two-state solution, but we can let them govern themselves. How is that playing in Israeli society, and how's that playing on the Palestinian side?
So you got him just right. Netanyahu's policy was to keep Hamas strong enough, and in fact, he allowed them to get money from Qatar and so forth, so that he could say that there is no one to talk with on the Palestinian side, and to keep the Palestinian Authority not only weak, which he did, but also basically as a pliant agent of Israeli rule there, keeping it corrupt and doing all what he said, keeping the order, the sanitation services and so forth going so that the Israelis don't do it, but the Israeli army could go in whenever it wanted to and enforce whatever arrest, order, however it defined it. And most of the Israeli public bought into this. Most of the Israeli public accepted that, we can manage this situation. What effect that had over time? Well, on the Israeli side, for years, much of what the Israeli military was doing, certainly the infantry, was acting as policemen. Generations of young men and women would be sent to the West Bank to police it. What did it mean to police it? To break into people's homes at 4 a.m, to stand at roadblocks and stop ambulances from reaching hospitals. It was basically controlling the population in a way that both humiliated people, brutalized them, and brutalized the occupiers themselves. In the Gaza Strip, Israel moved out of the Gaza Strip 16 years ago, surrounded it by a fence, had full control over what goes in and what goes out. And every once in a while had a policy of mowing the grass. So every few years would have a sort of attack mostly with aircraft and destroy what it called the Hamas infrastructure, which it never actually destroyed. It just brought about a lot of destruction to people. What does that do to the people living there?
Right.
It brutalizes them.
Question.
Yeah, I mean, people are desperate. People have no future. And so they vote, or they voted once, and Hamas had only one election campaign, but Hamas, at least initially, provided them with services, and was very extreme, and has remained very extreme. And people, when you treat them like that, then they vote for the most extreme elements against those who are keeping them in a cage.
Okay, so now let me ask you this. Now, that's you painted a picture of what it was like, especially in the last 15 years or so, and how it was dehumanizing to a lot of the Palestinians, and it had taken their hope away, etc. Now, then, you just wrote a piece in the New York Times a week or so ago, and you were talking about some of the issues of is there war crimes? Is there genocide? Is it, does this category? Almost it doesn't matter what the title it puts on it. There has been massive loss of life in Palestine and massive destruction on an unprecedented scale so far of the infrastructure where people can just live and just have a life to even have hope for any possibility future. What is this going to do now to the mentality of the Palestinian people, and what hope is there? And can you offer us any kind of a projected path to where the people of Israel and the people of Palestine can even possibly coexist in the same area. What does that look like to you now?
So look, I mean, I have to preface this by saying that the attack by Hamas on October 7th was something unprecedented in Israeli history and has really traumatized the Jewish population in Israel very deeply. And people feel insecure and angry. And the Israeli army feels that it was it's filled with shame. It wants retribution. It wants to restore its deterrence. And I think that right now, many people in Israel support this kind of massive destruction in Gaza, which is, sort of maybe understandable, but lamentable and does not lead us to any place we want to go to. What are the prospects for the future? So, look, I mean, it's first of all, it's a bit hard to know where this is going right now. I'd say that Israel is conducting massive military operations. It's got massive numbers of troops in there right now. The destruction has been horrendous. The city of Gaza is more or less flattened, as some Israeli political leaders had said they would be. And Israel has also forced about 1 million Palestinians to move from the northern part of the Gaza Strip to the southern part, and now is constricting them even further into the western part of the southern section of the Gaza Strip. So this is a very precarious situation.
Let me ask you this on that point right there at that point of the story, because so many people have been, I mean, it was already just as massive humanity as whatever 2.3 million in the strip itself. And now then you've compressed almost all of them into half the territory. And we've seen lots of images of like, complexes and what looks like hotels or whatever, just stuffed with people all inside, outside, everywhere. There's just nowhere to live. If the northern part of Gaza suffers the same kind of damage as this operation is completed here, and then they start moving into the southern part, where are people going to go when they start moving around down there? Because obviously, I mean, it's common sense that for the Hamas fighters that have been, been under attack, when all of these people have been moving south, it's certain that many of them have been infiltrated among that. So they're going to be in there. Now, how Israel is going to distinguish between just an angry man who's mad his house got blown up and an actual Hamas fighter, that I don't know. But what do you think is going to happen once let's just say that, forget about how this works out here, but what is militarily going to happen when they get ready to move into that area, the Israeli Defense Force?
I don't know if they can actually move to the entire territory. I think what they're thinking of now is moving the second phase, which was just declared by the Minister of Defense, to the eastern part of the southern part of the Gaza Strip. And I think that they, by and large, can destroy much, but not all, of the military infrastructure. I don't think that they are able to destroy the political leadership. Hamas is not only a military organization, it's also a social movement. It's deeply embedded in Gaza. So the only way to end this war is to, in my mind, is to change the entire paradigm within which it is operating. And there are two ways of this happening. One way is something that is coming out now increasingly in Israel, and it's very troubling, and that's an idea which is, by the way, being floated by the same people who were supporters of the so-called judicial overhaul. So it's the same bunch of people, and they have a base in the United States too, which is to basically export the population of Gaza elsewhere, to move them out of Gaza, to relocate them, and basically to ethnically cleanse them, and possibly to distribute them as refugees around the world. One has to remember, by the way, that most of the population of Gaza are refugees from, and their descendants from 1948, from that war. That is a a plan that would mean that Gaza would be emptied of its Palestinian population and then would become an area for settlement by Jews and would be incorporated into the Israeli state. Now, I don't think that's possible, but I think that's what these people are thinking.
So then that kind of answers the first question I had: is what is the prospects for an actual two-state solution now, which allegedly is America's official policy,
Yes.
but now that's becoming less and less even possible. And I'm afraid we're gonna have to leave it right there because there's so much more to talk about. I cannot wait to have you back. I hope you have time because we want to talk much more about that aspect of this because that is so crucial to what's going to happen next. And I know this stuff it keeps unfolding at rapid speed here, but we are very grateful for you coming on to the show today, Professor, and look forward to having you back very soon.
Thank you very much.
Very good. And that's all we have for Deep Dive today. If it makes some people happy or not, we're going to give you what you need. Thanks, and we'll see you next time on Deep Dive.